Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev, and in this video we're going to be doing another to-do list. Okay, it's been a while since I've done a to-do list, and I thought it was a good time to do another sort of just very basic HTML, CSS, JavaScript to-do list to review HTML, to review CSS, to review JavaScript. So this is going to be a great build for those who are often on the newer side and the beginner side. Okay, so right now I have my Visual Studio Code opened to a blank folder. So first we're going to just do our basic setup. Okay, so I'm going to have my browser open here to the side because we're going to be needing that in a second. So I'll just kind of do that. And what we're going to start off is by first we'll create a to-do.html. Actually, we'll put this all in a folder. Nah, we'll just do it here. We'll do a to-do.html. Might as well be index.html. I'm not going to put anything else in here. Okay, so there's my index.html. Again, index generally gets treated as sort of the main HTML file in a particular folder. So generally, it's the reason why that particular file, you don't have to say like the name in the file path. Like generally, if I put a URL and I want to refer to any other file than an index.html, I actually have to write that file name in the URL. Okay, generally, it's always going to assume I'm expecting a index.html in that folder. Just understanding how URLs work and general file servers work. Okay, but again, I have an HTML file, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up my HTML boilerplate. Boop. Okay, and what we need to do first is we're going to just set up the stage, like just create like a nice looking page for our to-do list before we actually create the functionality. Okay, so the idea is I'm going to create the canvas, and then I'm going to make that canvas interactive. Okay, so what I want to do is break up my website into sections. Okay, now there's a lot of different block level elements. So like the way you want to think of a div is a block of your website. Okay, it represents essentially a row of your website. But there are other elements that serve the same function. They're called the semantic tags that generally are literally a div, but they have a different name than div, so that way they mean something. Okay, and this includes like header, generally used to just say, hey, this is the block that represents the top of my web page. Okay, you might have like main, which represents, say, hey, this is the main content of my web page. It's a block, it's a div, so it just represents a row of your website. Okay, and then we'll have our footer, okay, which represents the bottom of your website. Again, these are just essentially glorified divs. This just makes it when you read your HTML, the meaning of what different sections of your website are clearer. Okay, I could have easily just made 3 divs. Okay, to represent these 3 sections of my website. Okay, but I'm going to open this up with Live Server. So if you don't have the Live Server extension, you can always go to here, the extension sections of VS Code, look up Live Server, and download Live Server. Okay, cool. So essentially, let me do that. Right click, open with Live Server. That's going to open up the page over here. And what Live Server does is that it's going to pay attention to anytime I update my file. And anytime I update my file, it's going to reload the page so that way I can see the changes. Okay, so right now there's no content. So if I were to open this up in my dev tools, so I right click, look and inspect, these are my inspector my dev tools, I can see that the 3 tags are there. So I can see like, hey, look, there's the header, the main, the footer. They just don't have any content in them. Okay, so my header is really just going to be like the title of my page. So H1, I'm going to say my cool to-do list. Okay, and we see the title right there. And again, if I take a look in my HTML body in the header, I can see that the H1 is inside the header. Okay, H1s are also a block element, but they're a special block element, meaning they create their own little row. And you can see that like if I highlight the H1, you can see like the H1 takes up the full width of the page. And the header takes up the full width of the page. Every block takes up the full width of the page. Okay, or the full width of the space available to it. Because if it's inside of another block that's smaller, then it's going to take up the full width of that block. Okay, basically you have to kind of think of web pages as a bunch of blocks. Okay, so here I go. I have this header. This represents the top of my page. And I don't want it to look like that. That's not, pretty per se. So that's where I'm going to want to introduce CSS to describe how I want things to look like. Okay, so the simplest way to do that, or the way we're going to do that is we're going to create our own CSS file. So we're going to say styles. Again, the name doesn't matter. Styles.css. Now this CSS file is going to allow me to express rules regarding how certain things should look like on the browser. Okay, for me to do that, I need to connect this CSS file to my index.html because my browser is loading the HTML file. So if my HTML file doesn't say, hey, reference the CSS file, then it doesn't know to do that. So the way you do that is you use what's called a link tag. So I'll set up a link tag. So this is a link tag. And this link tag needs to have two attributes. One attribute is rel that tells it, hey, this particular link, this particular connection is for a style sheet. So it's telling you style rules. Okay? And then an href, which is a hyperlink reference, meaning this is where you'll find the thing. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to /styles.css. / always means, this always just means starting from the folder that this file is in. Okay, so it's going to look inside the folder that index.html is in. And the reason I'm doing that is because styles.css is in the same folder on my computer. Okay, and then look for a file called styles.css. I could also do /styles.css. That's a relative URL, meaning it's not looking in the same folder. It's going to just assume that the URL is 127.0.0.01 port 5500 /styles.css, which would also work because the way the live server works, the way it serves things, is that it's serving this folder as the core of the website. So in that case, relatively, that'll be the URL. But to keep it simple, we're going to use the dot, meaning in this folder. Okay? So the idea is that I just have to kind of tell it where to find the thing. I have to tell it where to find the CSS file, and then it can load up. Okay, and I can always just double check that by going in my DevTools and going to sources. And I can see that, hey, look, the index.html is loaded, the styles.css is loaded. I have confirmed that this file is connected. Wonderful. Now I want to make that header look a little bit nicer. So maybe first I want to style that header tag. So let's see here. I go to styles. So just to target the header tag, I just type in header. Okay, if you're targeting a specific HTML tag, you just literally put in the name of the HTML tag. Okay, so what I want is that header to have a background color. Let's see here. We'll just choose one of these colors. We'll say the color should be cadet blue. Okay, and see now that whole thing is cadet blue. Now notice I don't like how there's this little white space here, whatnot. It's just because generally there's default styling already existing in the browser, and I kind of want to get rid of it because I don't like that. So what I can do is I can do what's called a reset. This is going to be a very basic reset. Usually you can install it there's other pre-made style sheets that reset everything, meaning they just zero out all the pre-existing styles. But if you just need to do a quick and dry reset, I can do something like this. I'll choose this. This means everything, so I'm selecting everything. So I'm targeting everything. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to say, padding 0. So there's no padding by default. There's no margin by default. Okay, and see how that kind of now is more flush to the top. And I'm going to do one other thing. I'm going to change border box or box sizing to border box. Now what this does is typically when you measure the width of a block, okay, so again this is a block, generally what it's going to do is that when you add padding, margin, so again padding is cushion on the inside, margin is cushion on the outside, and then a border is just a line around the edge. Okay, but whenever you add margin, padding, or a border, instead of it being using the existing width of the element, it'll add to it. So if I had a 300 pixel width block and then added a 10 pixel border, okay, it would add 20 pixels to the width because it would be 10 pixels on border on one side and then 10 pixel border on the other side. So you're adding an extra 20 pixels, okay, of width, which may not be so you have to kind of factor that into your calculations. Now, if I do border box sizing, then what it does it more intuitively. So instead of adding to the width, it'll just use the existing width. So it'll take 10 pixels from the existing 300 pixels of width. So my box is no wider, it just now has a 10 pixel border that's included in the 300 pixels I allocated towards it. I find that to be a lot easier way of thinking about spacing things, so I generally will switch over to that. Okay. So cool. So now that's kind of looking better, but to see these letters, they're a little too tight. Okay, it's a little too tight. Okay, so I don't want to create a margin. So I don't want more of that white space that's around, What I want is I do want some space inside the header to make sure that my letters aren't so like tightly nestled against the thing. So that's called padding. So in my header, I'm going to add some padding, and we're going to say like 10 pixels. Okay, and you see like that gives it a nice little cushion. That looks a little bit better. Okay, and I want to make sure that this is centered. Okay, but this text is not inside the header. Okay, so if I look at my HTML, this text is not inside the header. It's inside the H1 with it, which is its own block. So what I may want to do is target the H1 and say, hey, H1, I want the text aligned in there to be centered. Okay, and you can see the syntax for CSS is that you say, hey, this is what I'm targeting, and then all the rules I'm applying are in here, and then I separate each rule with a semicolon, and it's always like what thing I'm changing and what am I changing it to. Okay, and cool. Okay, so that's looking nice. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to set up my main block. Okay, this is going to be where all my my to-dos show up. Okay, so I want that to kind of not necessarily take up the full width. So we're going to say width, main. So we're targeting that main element. And I'm going to say that, hey, the main element should have a max width of 350. And the reason I choose 350 pixels, I like that for like smartphones. That's generally going to work for most smartphones as far as like the width of the smallest phones, with the exception of the Galaxy Fold. I don't bother with the Galaxy Fold. Okay, this is too much work to try to plan for a 200 pixel width. Okay, max width, but you don't really see that right now. Okay, so let's do something else. And let's say now if I highlight it, so if I highlight the main tag, so you can see that it is a 350 pixel width now. Okay, the problem is there's nothing inside of it, so you can't really see anything. So we'll leave it like that for now. So that way I can visually edit it once we actually have something in there. And then we're going to have our footer. Our footer is going to be where, in this situation, we're going to put our form for adding things to the to-do list. So really all you need to do is say, hey, what is the to-do? And then click a button to submit. So we're going to keep it real simple. I'm going to use a form. Okay. And then in that form, we're going to have an input. Okay, and the type equals text. And then we have to give the input a name. You'll see why later. And then we'll call this input name what should we call it? Like the to-do. So that adds an input box. We see the input box there. And then we want to add a button. Input type equals submit. So it's a submit button. And then we're going to say value, which is going to affect what's on the button. And we're going to say the value is add to do. Okay, so that way it makes it really clear. I can see that, hey, I fill out this form and add to do. Now, the user may not know to fill out this form. So what I might do is add a placeholder. A placeholder attribute is going to add some like grayed out text that kind of tells the user what to write here. So I'm going to say, write new to do. And see now it says like write new to do over here, making it like a little bit easier for the user to kind of figure out what's going on. Okay. So there we go. But this form is kind of ugly, right? You're like, this is not the prettiest to do. So I'm going to head back over here. And again, if you notice, like these two to-dos, they're both or these two inputs, they're input tags. So I'm going to target first. I'm going to just style input tags in general. So we're going to say input. Okay, I want the font size to be bigger. So we're going to say, generally I want to use like EMs, which an EM is a relative file size. So basically when I say 1 EM, it means 100% of the current font size. So every browser is going to have a default font size. So I'm saying 100% of the default. So if I say 1.2, I'm saying 120% of the default. Okay, and you see that got bigger. Okay, cool. But you see again, the letters are too nestled inside these two things. So I'm going to want to add padding to add cushion on the inside, from the inside of the block. So once again, I'll add some padding. I'll say like 10 pixels again. Okay, see that's starting to look a little bit nicer. Okay, but now this is way too nestled against the thing that came before it. So you see, like, it's like touching it. I don't want that. So that's where margin comes in. It's cushion on the outside. Okay, so I'm going to say margin 10 pixels as well. Okay, so now we have some cushion there. That looks nice. But I want these two things to be centered. Fortunately, inputs are treated as text. Okay, so they're not blocks like a div or an h1 or a main or a header, which are blocks. They represent a separate row. They represent text. So that's why you see them both on the same line, because they're in line with each other. So in that case, I could just use text align center to center it. Okay, although technically that's the wrong place to put it. Both of them are inside the footer, so I need to center the text inside the footer. Because the idea is I need to center the thing that tell the thing that it's in to center the text inside of it. So I need to tell the footer to text align center. Okay, nice. So cool, we have a deal. So now we can start actually creating the functionality. Now what I want to do is actually start setting up that main to have like some space. So let's give it some height. We'll say 500 pixels. So that way it's visible, even though this has nothing inside of it yet. Maybe 500 pixels is too big. Let's try 300. Yeah, okay, that works. Okay, 300 pixels, and let's give it a background color so you can see it, because right now it's just white, so it just kind of blends in with everything. We'll say Burleywood. Okay, so you can see that there's that block. There's our main block. See, I gave it, again, it's only 350 width, but you see by default, it's going to be flush to the right. Now, text align center is not going to help me here, because the main is a block. So again, certain HTML tags are blocks, certain HTML tags are inline elements, meaning they get treated like text. So I always try to, and how do I know? I go look it up. You go to the documentation and you read how each different tag is treated. But a main is a block, so whenever you need to center a block, because you made the block less than 100% width, then what you do is you have to use margin. It's just the way it works. Then you do is you set the margin to auto. But I still want that margin from the top, because I don't want these two things like touching like that. So I'm going to say, hey, the first number is going to represent the margin for the top and the bottom. So I'm going to say 10 pixels, top and bottom. And then I'm going to say auto for the second one, so that way it centers it. Okay, so you see it's automatically setting the margin for left and right, and then setting it 10 pixels top and bottom. Okay, and see now we're starting to get kind of a nice little visual effect. Okay, cool. So there's our canvas. Okay, so now we need to make this interactive, because right now, I mean, I can type in this, and I can click this button, but it doesn't really do anything. Okay, so right now it doesn't do anything. Cool. For that, we need a JavaScript file. Okay, so we're going to create a new JavaScript file. We'll call it app.js. And just like our CSS file had to be connected to the HTML file, our HTML file needs to be aware of this JavaScript file. Okay, so I'm going to go back to my index.html, and now I need to add a script tag. That's how you connect JavaScript to your HTML. So script tag. And then I'm going to use this source attribute, which tells it, hey, where is the file you're connecting? So I'm going to say ./app.js. And the thing is, I don't want this JavaScript file to run until after this is all loaded. Okay, so I want to make sure that this is loaded before this file runs. Okay, so in order to do that, all you have to do is just add a keyword called defer. So literally, I just hit space and then add defer right there in the tag, and that's going to basically delay the running of this script tag until after the body has loaded. Okay, because if not, then none of this stuff is going to exist when technically my code is run. So I want to avoid that, because again, the way the browser is going to read the code is starting from the top, working its way to the bottom. Okay. Okay, so now that we have that connected, and again, I can always double check by clicking on sources. So I go to sources, and I can see, hey, look, there's the app.js is now connected. Wonderful. So now I'm going to head over to my app.js, and what you want to do is think through what your user stories are. What do I mean by user stories? Like, what is the user going to do? So the user, okay, and generally we always try to create for functional. I won't get into CRUD right now. Let's just say our user stories are, we should be able to create a to-do. So that's our first story. Okay, and how did that story work out? Okay, so essentially a user should be able to, write in the input box. So right now I'm just writing comments. This is just to help me think through what happens. Okay, then click the button. Okay, and then the to-do appears with the other to-dos. Okay, so that's our first user story. Okay, now the other user story is they should be able to complete a to-do. Okay, the user should be able to click on a to-do, and then the to-do should disappear. Okay, so by thinking through my user stories, it's going to be much easier for me to think through what I need to do. Okay, because now that I know, okay, hey, and then start with one story at a time. Don't try to do the whole thing. First, let's create this whole ability to create a to-do, and then we will work on completing to-dos. Okay, so generally, if I'm going to be able to like manipulate to-dos, I should probably have somewhere where I track these to-dos. Okay, and I'm probably going to have a bunch of functions that are going to affect those to-dos. So a very useful way of doing this, okay, is what I will do is I'll create an object, const to-do. Now to-do represents the unit of data, okay? This is also referred to as a data model. So our data model is to-do, okay? So typically what you'll see in variable naming is that you'll generally have a variable that allows you to interact with your data model, has a bunch of built-in functions to interact with that data model. And typically anything that represents a data model is going to have a singular uppercase name. So the idea is I'm going to have this variable called to-do, and it's going to represent me working with my to-dos. Okay? And it's going to equal an object. And this object is going to have several properties. So again, this is my data model. Essentially, this represents the data that my application works with. Okay, the idea is I need to have somewhere to store it because I'm not working with a database here. I could work with a database, but again, this is a very beginner-friendly tutorial. So the idea is the simplest way for me to store data just basically would be like an array. Okay, so we're gonna have a property called to-dos, and this is assuming you know what objects are. So if you don't know like the basic building blocks of JavaScript, you should go watch all my like introductory JavaScript videos, like objects masterclass, array masterclass, all these videos where I go into these things much more in depth. Okay, so to-dos is going to represent the actual like array of to-dos. Okay, cool. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a bunch of functions to work with that. Okay, so I'm going to write a function called get to-dos. Okay, and then what this function is going to do is that it's going to return the list of to-dos. So it's going to return to-dos.to-dos. Okay, that's all that function does. Okay. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to put one example to-do in here so we know how does a to-do look like. So generally one item, so an array represents like a collection of items. One item should always generally be an object. Okay, so every to-do is an object, and each to-do has a property called text. Okay, and which will be, let's say, breakfast. Okay, and then we'll have another to-do. So our model here is pretty straightforward. The model is literally just one string called text. That's the model. So each property of our data model, there's only one property. Okay, so it's like basically again the data model is the shape, the design of our data. Okay, and then this data model object, okay, is just something for us to work with that data model. So that way we have all the pieces we need to do so. Okay, so again, this is going to represent the list of to-dos. That's what this property equals. This function get to-dos will retrieve our to-dos. The other thing I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to add to-dos. So we're going to have a function that adds a new to-do. Okay, so we'll call it create to-do. And basically this is going to take a new to-do as an argument. So we have to pass a new to-do into the function. Again, if you don't know about functions, watch my function masterclass. And what it's going to do is that all it's going to do is going to take that to-do.to-dos array and push the new to-do into the array. Okay. And then we're going to have a remove to do function, because we're going to also remove to dos. And that's going to, so we'll call that this, or delete to do. And I got to make sure I put a comma after the last property for each of these properties. And delete to do is going to be a function that's going to take an index for a to do you want to delete. And then what's going to do is going to take to do dot to dos, that's the array. Then it's going to use splice to get rid of the to do at that index. So basically starting at that index, it'll remove one item. That's how the splice function works. And again, for that, you can watch my array methods video to learn more about how the array methods work. So now, let's say it just saves me a lot of time, because instead of me having to write all this logic out every time I want to add a to-do or delete a to-do, I can just use this object. This object will just be the way I interact with to-dos. Okay? Wonderful. Now what's going to happen is that every once in a while, I'm going to want to, okay, render the to-dos to here, okay, show the to-dos on the screen. So I should probably create a function for rendering what should be on the screen. Okay, specifically, the only thing I really need to render here is what's inside this main element. Okay, because that's going to be where the list of to-dos exists. Okay, so we'll call this our render function. Basically, anytime this function renders, it's going to take my data from my data model and then update what's on the screen. Okay, so I want to say const render. Not const render, yeah, that's fine. Const render, and it's going to be a function. So I'm using arrow functions. Okay, so there's my function. And essentially what's going to happen is that every time this function runs, we're going to go grab that main element. Okay, const main equals, and the way I do that is I'm going to use the document. So document.querySelector. Okay, if you're not familiar with the document and query selector, that's for me to grab elements from the DOM. I have a whole series of videos. If you look up my sort of DOM playlist, document object model, DOM and jQuery playlist, you will see the big heavy duty treatment on that. So I highly recommend watching that. Okay, document.querySelector. So I'm going to grab the main element. So basically that's going to store the main element in this variable because that's where I want to work. But you know, I may have already added stuff to it, but every time I do this, I want to rebuild the whole thing. So what I'm going to do is the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to empty the main div. I'm just going to say, hey, I want to clear it out. Anything that's in there, I want to destroy it. So I'm going to say main dot inner HTML. So that's going to take the whatever's inside any HTML that's currently inside that block here. And I'm going to just turn it to nothing. I'm going to say, hey, just make it nothing. It's an empty string, so it's nothing. I've cleared it out. Okay. So far right now, my JavaScript's doing nothing. I've just created an object with some functions, and I'm creating this other function, but I haven't used any of it yet. So keep in mind, nothing really changes here yet. Because this is generally like how you want to do it. You want to kind of set up your pieces that you're going to need. Because then when you need to actually build out the logic, it becomes a lot easier because you have all your pieces in place to handle different things. Okay? And then what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to loop over the list of to-dos to create the things I want to create. Okay? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a div or a block for each to-do. Because I don't have a, I forgot. Well, let's add a. Nah, we'll just use divs. Okay. Empty the main div. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to loop over the to-dos, create a div for each to-do. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a for loop. So I'm going to take. So first I need to go get the array of to-dos. Okay, I can do that by just doing like to-do.getTodos. Because again, this function that I wrote over here, what does this function do? It's going to return me the list of to-dos. Okay, return to-dos. So since this function returns the array, I can then chain off of that and then use the arrays for each method, which lets me loop over that array. All I have to do is pass it a function. Okay, so I'm going to pass a function to the for each. Again, this function is going to receive the individual item from the array and also receive the index on each loop. So I'm going to declare those and then define what's going on in my function. So for each to-do, So for each to-do in my list of to-dos, what I want to do is create a div. So const div equals document.create element. So I'm creating a new HTML node for a div. Then what I want to do is we're just going to set the text. So the div's text. So set the div's text to the to-do. So const, or not const, div.innerText equals, and then we just say it's going to equal the item, because this will be the first to do, then the second to do, then the third to do every time I run this function. Okay, and then we're going to want to append the div to the main tag. So we're going to take the main element, which I have saved in this variable called main, because again we created that variable up here, so it exists inside these curly brackets, so it's available anywhere in there. So I can say, hey, main.append, which means, hey, put this HTML, this node, inside of that main tag. And I'm going to append this div. Okay, there we go. And that's all that really needs to do right now. That's it. Okay, so generally, if there's any to-dos that exist, I should render them when the page opens up. So I'm going to literally call the render function at least once when the page loads. So I'm just going to call it right there. And you see it worked, but wait a second. Notice it says object object. The reason being is that this item doesn't equal text. It equals this object. I don't want it to equal the object because the object isn't the thing that I need. I need the property, the text. So really what I want innerText to equal is item.text. Okay, I want to access that individual property, and there we go. Perfect. Let me change this to lunch. So we can see there's two to-dos in there. Okay, so you see what's happening is that it's running the get to-dos function. So it's getting this array of to-dos. Then it's looping over that array of to-dos, creating a div, and then putting that div in this block. Okay, I want to style these divs, so I'm going to add a class to them. Okay, so we're also going to say add a class of to-do to the div. Okay, so we're going to say div.classList.add. This function allows us to add a class to that node, and I'm going to add a class of to-do. Okay, so now if I go in here, see I see the two divs, and see they both have the class of to-do. Okay, and see they've both been put inside of the main tag. Because again, here I appended them to that main element. Okay, so again, always rely on your elements tab that kind of help guide you on what's changing and what's happening in the DOM. Because as you see here, it's not going to be reflected in the HTML file. The HTML file is only a starting point, and then my JavaScript's changing it after it started. Okay, cool. So right now I am displaying my to-dos. But this kind of looks ugly, so I want to make those to-dos look a little bit nicer. So now I can go back to my CSS. I added that class of to-do, so I can target it. So again, since it's a class, I specify that it's a class using that dot in front of it. That means it's a class. So now I can say, hey, I want the text to be centered. So text align center. Okay, those are centered. We're going to say we want some padding. So we'll say padding of 5 pixels. Okay, we want some colors to kind of help differentiate them a little bit. So background color, we'll say white smoke. Okay, but see, like now this looks like one big block. So let's put some margin so you can see that there's different ones. Margin, we'll say like 5 pixels. Okay. Let's make it like 10 pixels. Okay, and that works, but you see like it's still touching like the top of this block. So what I want to do is I want to put some padding inside that main element. Padding 5 pixels. So that way it pushes, nothing is touching the edge of that main block. Okay, just putting some inside cushion on the main block. Okay, so perfect. Okay, so that's looking kind of nice. Okay, not like, you know, again, we're not going to spend hours designing this, but just as a little flourish, we'll add a border radius, which rounds the corners. And we'll just say it's like 10 pixels. Okay, and see now each one has like a nice little rounded corner, just as a little like flourish. Cool. Now So far, so good. Okay, and I want to make it where you can see that you can click on these things. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the cursor. Actually, no, not there. What I want to do is change what happens to the to-do when you hover over it. So if I say I'm going to target the to-do class, and then I'm going to use this pseudo class called hover. That means, hey, what happens when you hover over something that matches that? Okay, what I want is the cursor to change to pointer. Okay, there's a cursor called pointer. And what that's going to do is that now when I hover over these, so you see like it changes to like that. So that makes it a little bit more obvious that I can click on it. Okay, and to do that even better, what I can do is we can also change the color. So we're going to say, hey, the color of the font is going to become white smoke. And the background color of the little block will become, we'll say, brown. Okay, so now when I hover over it, see the color changes, and I get the cursor. So that makes this just look a little bit more clickable, a little bit more obvious for the user that they can click on this. Right now they can't. Like if I click on it right now, it does nothing. So it just looks like that. Okay, but notice like that change is a little abrupt. I can make that look a little bit more smoother. I can use what's called a transition. So by adding a transition on the default state, so the to-do class, so I have what's called a transition, no, not transform, transition. I can say, hey, whenever this thing changes, don't just change it right away, change it slowly. So I'm going to say, hey, whenever the color changes, change it over like 0.3 seconds. And also when the background color changes, change that over 0.3 seconds. Okay, so now when I hover over it, see it's a little bit more of a smoother effect. Okay, it doesn't look so abrupt. Okay, giving it a nicer effect. Okay, so nice. So little cool things we can do. So now I need to do two things. Right now it's still technically what we have on the screen is still technically not usable. I can't type anything in here and do anything, and I can't click on these and remove those. Okay, but I have all the pieces I need to get that going. So first let's handle the add. Okay, so what I need to do is handle like what happens when I fill out this form. Okay, so what I want to do is we're going to handle the form submission. Okay, now again, we have the form wrapped in a form tag. Okay, so I don't need to have multiple things. The form tag bundles all those inputs. So generally everything I need I can just do with that form element. There's no reason for me to grab the individual inputs now. Okay, and I'll show you how that works out. Okay, so what I can do is I'm going to go grab the form. So I'm going to say const form equals document dot query selector, and I'm going to go grab the form element. Okay, and then to handle the form submission, that's an event. So forms have a special event called, first let's just say add event listener. So we're going to add an event. They have a special event called submit. So whenever I click on a button that's inside of a form, that is treated as a submit event. Not a click event, but a submit event. I am submitting the form. Okay, so that's the event I'm listening for. And then I'm going to have my function. Now, the problem is, like, we'll take a look at what happens when I click on this button. You'll notice the page like refreshes. Okay, so notice like there's like this little like refresh. Okay, the way forms are designed is that typically when you submit it, it takes you to another web page. But we don't want to do that. Okay, we want to override that default behavior. Okay, fortunately, the browser gives you a way to do that. So whenever you have this function that you pass into the add event listener, that function is receiving an event. Okay, it's basically this giant object that the browser is generating when an event happens. So I click, then a click event happens, a click event object gets created. When I submit a form, a submit event object gets created and gets passed to any function that responds to that event. Okay, the browser is generating this object. Okay, now this object has a function in it called prevent default. And this prevents the page from refreshing. Prevent refresh when form is submitted. Okay, so now if I click the page, if I click add to do, See, you don't see that like refresh over here. You don't see everything kind of like resetting itself. Okay, perfect. So that's good. Okay, so that's good. Now what I need to do is get the data from the form. Okay, I could go grab the input individually and just grab the value from the input, but since I have everything bundled in a form, there's actually a better way of doing it. Okay, what I can do is, okay, generate a form data object. A form data object allows you to access the data from a form. So basically, if I had 100 inputs, instead of me having to go, grab 100 inputs individually, I can just generate this form data object. Okay. So what I'll do is I'll say const form data equals new form data, and then what you do is you pass it the form. Okay, you pass it the form element. So what this does, it takes the form element from the HTML and generates this object that allows us to pull the data from. Okay, and I'm going to save that object in this variable. Okay, and now inside that form data object, I am now able to access the data. So I can be like form data.get, and then I pass in the name of the input that I want to access. That's why it was important for us when we created the input that we added this name property. Okay, so in that case, what I want to do is access this input, so I have to pass in the name of to do. Okay, so I would, over here, I would say, okay, I want to go get the to do property. Okay, and if I look at my console here, and let's first add it to do, so we'll say cheese. I hit add to do, and see, I get back cheese. Because when the form was submitted, this input, which has the name of to do, had cheese in it. Okay, so again, it doesn't matter how many inputs I have, I can now easily grab them using that form data object. Okay, how convenient is that? So now what I want to do is create a new to do. Okay, so const new to do equals. Okay, and what I'm going to want to do is make sure that it follows the same pattern. So it should be an object with a property called text. So I'll just copy that and say, hey, a new to do equals this, except it's not going to be statically breakfast. It should be whatever was from the form. So that's where I'll use like form data dot get, and then say, hey, I want to get that to do property, because that's the text that I want to equal the text property of this object. Okay, so now I have this new to do object, and now I want to add the to do to the array. And luckily, I already have a function for that, right? Because we created this whole like create to do's function earlier. So I can use that. So I can be like, okay, to do dot create to do, and then just pass in the new to do. Okay, and then that's going to do the job. Okay, and then what I want to do is just update the DOM. Okay, and luckily I have a function that's built for that, render. So then I just call render, and that's going to update the DOM. Okay, so now I see that, hey, every time I click this button, I'm really just getting the data from the form, making a new to do, adding the to do to my list of to dos, and then updating what I see on the screen. So let's see if that works. Okay, so let's add dinner. And there it is, dinner. Okay, if I add brunch, brunch. Cool. But right now, if I click on these, again, these don't go away. So I need to change that. So what I want to do is that every time I create an LI, I want that particular, not an LI. Every time I create one of these divs, I want that particular div to have an event to remove it. Okay, fortunately, I have access to the div I created from within this curly bracket. So that's probably the best place for me to add this event listener. So before I wrap up this loop each time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure at the end of each loop that I add that particular div, I give that particular div an event. So I'm going to say, hey, div.add event listener. So I'm going to add an event to each div. Okay, so we're going to add a click event to delete each to do. And I say, hey, whenever you click on this div, I want something to happen. And basically what I want to happen is I want to use that delete function, because again, we created that delete function earlier, delete to do, so we can just pass that. I just have to pass it the index. Fortunately, in my for each loop, I have the index, because that's one of the two things that the for each loop gives me in the callback, or in the function that I pass in. So I can just say, hey, to do dot delete to do, and pass in the index. Okay, simple as that. Okay. So then I'm going to delete the to-do. And then I need the, but the thing is that just because I delete it doesn't necessarily mean the screen updates. Okay, I need to rebuild all those divs again. So what function do I have for that? Render. Okay, update the DOM. So I call render again, and that's going to update the DOM. Okay, so now let's try this out. So now I should be able to delete these. If I click on breakfast, gone. Lunch, gone. Okay. And then I can say, hey, eat cheese. Okay, so it works. Okay, that's wonderful. So we have a functioning to-do list, and that's all fun and good. The only problem is that now whenever I refresh the page, okay, it starts over. So that's not fun. What if I wanted to like save it? So there is a way to store data built into the browser called LocalStorage we can use. So that way when the user comes back, it's going to have, you know, their list of to-dos. Okay. So what we'll do is we're going to want to create a function. We're going to add a couple more functions to our model here that basically is going to allow us to save our list of to-dos in local storage. Okay, so we're going to add a function called save to-dos to local storage. Okay, and we're going to say save to-dos. And essentially what this should do, okay, is all it's going to do is just basically save the to-do. So basically the way you do is you do local storage, so something you can access right there. Local storage is built into the browser, so you don't have to like do anything special. And then what you want to do is set an item. So you're going to say, hey, I want to set a property. And basically what you do is you save things under a string. So you save it under a name. So we'll call it to-dos. That's what we're going to save it under. And what we want to do is save that array. But we have to save, we can't just save the array. We have to save a string. You can only save strings in local storage. So what I need to do is take that array and turn it into a string, which I can do with a function called json.stringify. Okay, so essentially what I want to do is save the json.stringify value of the to-do.todos. Okay, so what I'm doing is taking the to-dos, okay, and saving them. Then we're going to have a load to-dos. Okay, load to-dos from local storage. So I want to load those to-dos from local storage, so that way it's loaded. Okay, so we'll have a function called load to-dos. And what this function is going to do is that it's going to go to local storage, and again, I got to make sure I put a comma between each property, so comma there. Okay. Actually, let me break this other function up just to make it a little bit more obvious what's going on. Okay. So we're going to turn the array into a string. Const array string equals. So that's what this is doing. This is turning the array into a string. And then I'm saving that string in local storage under to-dos. Save array string in local storage. Okay, that's just so you can procedurally see like, hey, like what are the steps that I'm taking. Okay, now load to-dos, I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to first go get the string back. So I'm going to go get the string from local storage. Okay, and then what I'm going to do is just say const array string equals local storage dot get item. So I'm getting something from local storage, and I want to get whatever's stored inside of to-dos. Okay, but here's the thing. What if there's nothing inside of there? Well, then I'm going to get back undefined. So in that case, I want to check to see if anything is in there. So I'm going to say, hey, const array string. If there's actually data in there, that's going to resolve as true, because undefined is false. Any string is true, exception of an empty string. So, but this is going to be a string array, so it's always going to be true. Okay, so basically I'm checking, hey, is there anything actually there? So when I got it, I went and fetched it, but is there anything actually there? If there's nothing there, I don't want to do anything. The function will just keep going. But if there is something there, then what I want to do is say, I want to turn the string back into array. Okay, turn the string back into an array. So the way I do that is I'm going to say const, to-dos equals JSON.parse. That's going to take a string that was stringified by JSON.stringify and turn it back into a JavaScript object or a JavaScript array. Because generally you stringify arrays or objects, and then you can turn them back into objects or arrays using parse. So I'm going to say parse the array string, and then you're going to basically update the list of to-dos. So what I actually want to do is I want to say, hey, going forward, to-do.to-dos should equal this array. So to-do.to-dos, which is again this property that has the array of to-dos, should equal this array that we just got back from local storage. And then that's it. Okay, so load to-dos will do that. Save to-dos will do that. Okay. Now, basically, going forward, what we want to do is we want to make sure that we save the to-dos after every time we do an update. Okay. So in that case, generally, when do we do an update? Whenever we create a to-do, we should probably save the list of to-dos. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to break this up in multiple lines. So every time we create a to-do, after we push the to-do, we should probably do a to-do dot save to-dos. Okay, and then every time we delete a to-do, we should also probably save the list. Okay, so then after every delete, we should probably to-do dot save to-dos. Okay, so now what's going to happen is that it's going to get saved every time we make a change, so that way local storage is always up to date. Okay, now we need to figure out how to load it when the page loads. Well, we just want to load it before we call render that first time. So right before we call render that first time, we'll do to-do.load to-dos. So that way it'll check local storage to see if there's any to-dos in there before it does that initial rendering. And now going forward, this thing will just save. So watch, like I can add dinner. Okay, that's in there. And now if I refresh the page, it's still there. Okay, and if I get rid of lunch, and then I refresh the page, it's still gone. Because now what's happening is that when the page loads, that load to-dos function is running to update the to-dos based on what's inside of local storage. And again, you can see what's inside of local storage by going to application. So you see right here, the section application. Right here, you can see the different ways you can store data in the browser. So we're talking about local storage. I click on local storage, and then you see that there's the list of to-dos. And you can see like the list of to-dos has all this data inside of it. Okay, so that's an easy way for us to store data. And now this becomes, and it's storing in the user's data, user of the browser. So if I were to put this up online, if I go to multiple computers, each computer is going to be a separate list of to-dos. But my computer will always show the same list every time I go to this page. So now this list persists. Okay, and you can see like this wasn't too bad. This all was 100 lines of code, and you have a fully functioning to-do list. Okay, and then with the sizing of things, now if I were to make this full screen, it's not going to look, this doesn't look horrible, but it's going to look pretty decent on a mobile phone. Like you can always test that out by clicking over here to see what it would look like on a mobile phone. Okay, and I can see here if I go to like an iPhone 5, I usually just I don't really have the iPhone 5 anymore, so the Pixel 5 works. Just see here, iPhone. Yeah, the Galaxy Fold is always a mess, so whatever. Samsung Galaxy, but you see it looks fine on most screens. Okay. And you can see how it's kind of look like on different size screens. So that's the thing you can do. So that way you can build what's called a responsive website, and you can use media queries to change it. So for example, just to show you an example of a media query, let's see here. Let me open up that again. Let's go into mobile mode. Okay. Now if I take a look at, let's see here, the iPad Air. See, that's not ideal. Okay. So basically here we're talking about a screen that's 820 pixels wide. So maybe we want to change that max width when the screen gets wider. Okay. So on the iPixel 5, that 350 made sense because like the width is 393, so that's perfect. Okay. Now when we get to above that, so let's say when we get to above Surface Pro, iPad Air, Okay, this is 820. So we'll say, hey, once you get above like 700 pixels, we'll expand that a little bit to like 750. Okay, so let's do that. How would I do that? Okay, I'm going to head over to my CSS styles, and then what you do is you're going to do an add media. Okay, and what that does, okay, add media screen, then you can specify like what the size is. Okay, so add media min. Think about that. Add media. Yeah. Always double check the syntax just in case. Media queries. Forget where the parentheses exactly goes. Yeah. Okay. I got it. Yep. Okay. So technically I need to add the word and here. Okay. Screen and the minimum width is, we'll say 700 pixels. Okay, so if it's a screen, not like some other non-screen, like a printer or something like that, because you can actually put different styling for like a printer. There's different options. And the screen is 700 pixels in width or more, then we'll apply this screen. And what I really want to change is that main element. Okay, so that main will have a minimum width of 700 pixels in that situation. Okay, so see now it's wider for those bigger screens. And again, I could also put it in this responsive where I can drag it so I can see, hey, look, it stays small. And then once I cross that 700 threshold, it adjusts. Okay, and I can, keep creating more breakpoints. But anytime I want to put like a rule that use only when the screen is a certain size, I can do this, and this could be max width, min width, and so forth. Okay, but the idea is that this version of this copy of the rule will take over when these things are true. Okay, and that allows me to do that responsive styling. Okay, with that, we built this to-do list. You can find it in the GitHub repo that's in the video description. You'll find it under the folder to-do list 2023 because we'll build other to-do lists later on. Like, actually, I'll show you one more thing. What if I want to take these to-dos and instead of putting them like in a stack like this, okay, where let me just get rid out of mobile mode. Okay, what if instead of a stack like this, I want to put them like side by side? Okay, this is where like something called Flexbox comes in. So I can go to the main element because again, all these divs are inside of main. And again, just to confirm that, I can always double check, take a look inside my dev tools here. And if I take a look at main, see all the divs are inside of main. Okay, so what I want to do is change the way that main wraps them. Instead of stacking them on top of each other, I want them to put it in a row. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll go to the main div and say, hey, I want to change the way it displays things. And I want to change it to flex. Okay, and see now, you see like it changes them into rows. Let me get out of mobile mode there though. Okay, so see now they are rows. Okay, but now I don't like how this is like 100% tall. I don't necessarily want that. So what I can do is I can go like change the dimensions of each of those divs. Okay, so we're going to say, hey, for any div that's inside the main element, or actually we can just use the to-do class because they all have that to-do class. Okay, we can give it a set height of 200 pixels. Okay, that's still too much. So we'll say 50 pixels. Okay, that's looking a little bit better, but you can see like their widths are a little icky. So maybe we'll give them a set width of like 100 pixels. Okay, and see like that looks a little bit better. Okay, now if I keep adding to, and see, but now the difference is that now what Flexbox is doing, it takes any blocks inside of the parent block, so any of these divs inside of main, and now puts them in a row. And now as I add things, so if I add lunch again, then I add, brunch. But you see now it's trying to scrunch them up in that one row. I don't want it. I want it to wrap. So if I want that to happen, I have to go back to the main element where because that's the flex box, and say, hey, how do I want it to handle wrap? So I say flex wrap. Okay, and I want it to handle it via I want it to wrap. Okay, and see now it wraps them, but you see I still don't like the way it's spacing them. Like see like it when there's two elements, I'd rather they be centered at that point. Okay, so what I can do is I can change a property called justify content. That's how it's going to line them up. So we'll say center and see if that works. Okay, that looks a little bit better. Okay, that looks a little bit better. There's another option called space around that might work better. Okay, so yeah, like see that's like a little bit more even space between the different areas. Okay, and again, if I add dinner, you know, you see the deal. Okay. Problem is I gave this a fixed height, so see it goes over. So what if I want to handle that? Like, hey, like this is overflowing, and I don't want it to overflow like that. Okay. Well, that's the main element that's being overflowed, so I can change its overflow property. Okay, to scroll. Okay, so now it'll have a scroll bar inside of it for me to scroll inside of it instead of it just overflowing outside of the box. Okay, so a couple different options you can have there, and again, I can start getting rid of things by clicking on them. Okay, nice. Now notice that, like, although if I get rid of more of these things, I kind of would like this a little bit more centered vertically. This is a really nice aspect of a Flexbox, is because I can now also do align items, and that's going to handle the other axes. So basically, justify content handled, you know, the horizontal alignment. Align items will handle the vertical alignment. So now I can center that, and see now that's now perfectly centered, and it's, basically the spacing just works out a lot nicer. Okay, so Flexbox is pretty cool when you want to have like sort of that kind of effect. So something definitely to spend more time playing with. The idea is, again, things like Flexbox and Grid depend on the thing that the things are in. So these divs, they're inside of the main tag, so it would be the main tag that I would make a flex or a grid. That's what's called the container element. Okay, and then I'm changing the behavior of the container. So hopefully you guys enjoy that. My name is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev. Have a great day and enjoy.